Hello and welcome to Frankly Speaking, where we dive deep into regional headlines. I speak with leading policymakers and business leaders. I am Katie Jensen. On today's show, as the United Nations accuses governments at a recent environmental meeting in Germany of dragging their feet, we speak with the former first ever Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency and a senior advisor to the UAE climate envoy, Dr. Adnan Amin, to ask if the energy crisis is spurring governments to invest more in renewables, why major climate change meetings being held in the Middle East could change global policies forever, and if the UAE's clean energy projects can make a real impact or are only a PR stunt. Dr. Amin, thank you for joining us on Frankly Speaking. Now, important climate talks have taken place in Germany recently, but there's big concerns that developed nations and parts of the world, like the US and the EU, aren't contributing funds to help poorer nations deal with climate change as promised. Now, you and Dr. Sultan Al Jaber, who you work closely with, have both warned that future wars will be fought over rising sea levels and extreme weather events. Now, the UAE has given billions of dollars to international projects. Which countries aren't doing their part?
Well, climate is a global issue, and it requires every country in the world to do its part. But what it requires most, and this is the issue that was being discussed in Bonn in the intersessional meetings, what it requires most is that we share responsibility, and those countries that have done the most to create this problem contribute to the solution and contribute to the most vulnerable countries, which are now facing very severe climate impacts. We've had recent reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that has talked about the severity of the climate impacts we'll be facing from drought, changing weather patterns, increasing disasters, melting of ice, rising sea levels. All of these issues that we've talked about for so many years now actually find practical expression. We're beginning to see them impacting livelihoods in the developing countries. And there was a real expectation from the countries of the South that after Glasgow, when we had more or less concluded the negotiation part of the climate agreement of Paris, that we were now moving to the implementation part. And the expectation in the intersessional meeting in Bonn was that would be the focus. What happened, though, is that there was a real emphasis by developing countries on mitigation, which is that essentially we need to keep constraining emissions and that everybody needs to play a part in this. But for the developing countries, the issues were adaptation and loss and damage, complex issues about shared responsibility and the responsibility of developed countries to support developing countries. And that didn't happen. So I think we left Bonn with the sense that there's a lot more work to do and there's a lot to be done in terms of recreating a positive political environment for the next COP in Egypt.
And of course, there's big concerns because rich nations like the US, parts of Western Europe, Japan, Canada, some of the richest countries in the world, now they make up only 12% of the global population, and yet they've been responsible for more than 50% of fossil fuel emissions for more than 170 years. Now, John Kerry told the BBC at the start of the meeting in Bonn that the world was cooked if countries didn't immediately lower their emissions, but they've received a bit of flack for that. Rachel Jackson, who heads up the climate change group Corporate Responsibility, she says that the US, as the highest carbon emitter, needs to take more responsibility. She said the US cooks up delay after delay to avoid taking any responsibility or action on the climate crisis. It's not the US that's cooked, they're doing the cooking. Do you agree?
I think the current administration in the US, when it came into office on a very ambitious program of climate action and infrastructure investment and industrial transformation. That was music to the ears of everybody who was concerned about climate, because those are the big issues. How do we move to clean energy? How do we create a new paradigm for investment, and how do we create a new industrial infrastructure and a mobility infrastructure that reduces carbon. And there was a full expectation that this was the way the administration was going to go. I think the intention has been there. There have been a few gains, some initial climate-related measures have been taken, partly by executive authority of the president. There's been action at the states level, but essentially the ambitious Build Back Better bill, the climate action legislation that was expected has been frozen. At the same time, the US is facing a very difficult geopolitical situation, especially as concerns energy supply, and has moved from a position of urging for a rapid transition to clean energy, to now trying to secure as much fossil reserves as they can in the short term to ensure a kind of economic stability and a low price environment. That's very different from what the expectation was in terms of climate action by the US.
So it feels like you're saying there's so many challenges the world is facing right now that climate change, it's been very difficult for governments to prioritize it. So Leah, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warning earlier this year that saying that governments and business leaders are lying and urging them to do more. And you're right, it has been a challenging start to the year. We've seen the war in Ukraine dominate headlines. We're faced globally by a fuel and food crisis. How have some of these big events affected climate change action and the momentum moving forward?
I think the short-term impact has been fairly disastrous. I think the disruption in energy supplies coming into major economies and worldwide has really had an impact in terms of prices, but also has had an impact in spurring new exploration and production in fossil fuels and new investment in fossil fuel infrastructure. Again, in Europe, we see a lot of investment in LNG plants to receive shale LNG from the US, which is a very polluting gas. There's a lock-in time for that kind of infrastructure. If you're going to be spending billions of dollars on fossil infrastructure today, you cannot just write it off tomorrow. There's a lifetime of that plant that has to run, and there's a real risk of lock-in of fossil assets for a longer term in countries that frankly have the technological and financial ability to move very fast on clean energy. And I think that we would expect governments to start focus much more on that opportunity, not on doubling down and replicating the problems of the past, but looking for the solutions of the future, which are investment in new infrastructure, which are investment in clean energy, which are investment in climate resilience and in climate resilient agriculture and in water security. These are the areas where I think there's really a risk in the future.
So you feel that these higher and increasingly volatile fuel prices are going to potentially act as a catalyst for the greater adoption of renewables, particularly when we look at the war in Ukraine. Do you think in some respects it's leading to a faster adoption of this green energy push, particularly as Europe tries to reduce its reliance on Russian oil and gas?
Absolutely. I think it's going to accelerate that trend, but the trend is really down to the fundamentals. And the fundamentals are that today, the lowest cost power generation, very low cost, is coming from renewable energy. Solar, wind, increasingly geothermal, hydro, these are all sources of available renewable power. It requires that we need to grow the market for renewable energy. We need to grow the investment for renewable energy. And we need to start to adopt the infrastructure that will enable it. Part of that is investing in innovation and technology. While we already have the basis for a substantial growth in renewable power, we also need the enabling technologies, the digitalization, the ultra-high voltage grid, grid stability, the reverse metering, smart metering around the world. All of these will be enablers of a new modern energy system that's within grasp. But it requires focus from countries. It requires us also to overlook the kind of demands that are coming from vested interests in the current system, who are politically very powerful. we need to make this transition happen as a matter of urgency for political leadership, because everything we see in terms of projections of climate impacts, it's becoming more and more severe every year.
And it's tricky, isn't it, that balance? You know, we've certainly seen a lot of political and business leaders call for the production of more fossil fuels. President Biden, who's due to visit the Middle East next month, well, he has pledged to cut carbon emissions in half by the end of the decade. But at the same time, he's also calling for oil producers to ramp up production. That would only cause more devastating effects of climate change emissions. Do you feel, in your opinion, do you think his plans to scale up production, are they going to damage long-term climate goals, or do you feel that he's justified? We are facing an energy gap and something needs to fill that, and these are short-term measures he's talking about.
You know, it's hard to believe that it was only a few months ago that we were hearing the opposite narrative, that the US was going to move aggressively on climate action, on decarbonization. It was urging all countries to do the same. It's been taking that position in all negotiations. It has been sending envoys. You know, John Kerry traveled the world with a message about how important it was to decarbonize, move to clean energy, and the economic opportunity it brought. And here we are today with all the things that you say. You know, I think that you know, it's a very hard message for many people in the climate sphere to swallow.
Do you think the US has been hypocritical then? I know you're very diplomatic, but that's the feeling I'm getting from you, that the US has reneged on promises that it's talked about for such a long time.
Well, they were promises to themselves more than promises to anybody else, because it's not part of a negotiated agreement. I mean, that was the leadership role that the US was bringing to the table, and everybody was expecting a real leadership role to happen. Then reality intruded, and we have this situation where, you know, it's very much to do with electoral politics, in my view, because we have the midterms coming up in November, and essentially high gas prices at the pump are poisonous for the electoral chances for any party in power. But I think that there is a much more important longer-term perspective on climate. It's hotly contested in the US. It's not an easy thing for any administration to move forward on climate action, given the political hostility you see from many actors in the political space. But I think that, you know, there is an expectation from many that we would love to see more, you know, commitment and serious action from the US on this, both domestically and internationally.
And really being able to turn a lot of this talk into action on a community level, not just the way we produce energy, but also the way we transport our goods, the way we farm, and making some of these big decisions at a community level. Now, you have certainly spent your entire lifetime addressing a lot of these issues. You've had an incredible career at the United Nations. You were the first ever Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency here in the Emirates. These days, you're a senior advisor to the UAE Climate Envoy. What are some of the most significant changes you've seen here in the Emirates during your time, and what does carbon neutrality really look like?
Well, you know, it's a fascinating situation in the UAE. So after I completed my tenure at IRENA, I had gone to Harvard as a senior fellow to take time off and to think about energy and geopolitics and so on. And I was asked to come back when Dr. Sultan Al Jaber was appointed as the climate envoy to help really on the discussion on what the prospects for net zero were for the UAE. So the challenge in the UAE was, is the UAE in a position to begin to create a diversified economy that's climate proof in the future? A diversified economy on the basis of decarbonization and low carbon growth, then that can still generate the kind of prosperity that the people of the UAE have seen over the last 50 years. And we had a very intensive process of discussion led by Dr. Sultan. I was delighted to be a part of that and to help to develop the vision of what we could do. And essentially, the leadership of the UAE has been talking about diversification for a long, long time. They know that the future is going to be different and that the UAE has to evolve continuously to continue to be a modern, competitive economy. But in the UAE, there is a very interesting uh, economic case attached to it, which is that we believe that the kind of investment in low carbon with the new technologies and the innovation that we see in the market, working across a suite of technologies, developing much better technologies to manage water resources, developing clean energy resources. You know that the UAE has the lowest cost solar in the world. It's got one of the biggest solar plants in the world. We're planning to triple or quadruple solar capacity by 2025 from around 2 gigawatts to 8.5 gigawatts. So the rate of growth is immense. We're moving into a modern, low carbon energy economy. The UAE will continue to export fossil resources while there is demand. But the measures that we see being taken in ADNOC right now, which is powering its operations with renewable and nuclear energy, probably creating a situation where we have the lowest carbon intensity oil in the world, lowest carbon intensity gas in the world, and a positive competitive environment where you have a carbon tax in the future. The UAE will be well positioned in those markets as long as there's demand, but domestically will be creating a new modern decarbonized economy, which will be based on clean energy and which will have a suite of new technologies across food security, water management, industrialization, electric mobility, and so on.
There's certainly some incredible initiatives that are taking place here. But you're right, I do agree, oil and gas still makes up a big part of the economy. It's responsible for about a third of annual GDP. And despite a lot of these renewable initiatives, many of which you have played a crucial role in, there's no denying that the UAE still has one of the largest carbon footprints in the world per capita. So what do you say to those critics of the UAE who say that their green energy ambitions are little more than a PR stunt?
Well, I think that's not really a very fair statement. I think, first of all, look at the climatic environment of the UAE. We've had a lot of development. There's a huge expatriate population that is housed in the UAE. We developed a lot of infrastructure. With the temperature conditions that you have in the UAE, there's a huge demand for cooling. It's not possible to operate cities of the scale and caliber of Dubai and Abu Dhabi without a very serious infrastructure framework that incentivizes that gives kind of incentives to cooling. It's not a livable life. You don't have the same temperatures in other countries. The living conditions are quite severe. So that's one part of it where the per capita energy expenditure has to be high because of the conditions. But the other is that, if you look at the per capita basis, you're right, it's one of the high footprints. On an absolute basis, it's less than 0.5% of contribution to global carbon emissions worldwide.
But the population is much smaller here.
Yes. And so, the absolute impact on climate is quite low, but the commitment of the UAE government on decarbonizing has not been doubted. And we've seen carbon intensity decreasing year on year.
Do you think those types of programs are going to encourage other countries in the region, like Saudi Arabia, to introduce similar initiatives or sign up? Do you think for countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they can potentially act as trailblazers to show other other fossil fuel nations just what is possible?
I think that's exactly what's happening. And you see parallel developments in Saudi Arabia. NEOM will be a low carbon city. All of the new investments that you're seeing in renewables generation in Saudi Arabia are huge. The scientific and technological investment that is taking place in research and development in Saudi Arabia is very, very impressive. You see Saudi Arabia testing a range of technologies from clean energy to geothermal, new types of solar, new types of construction materials, all kinds of innovation is taking place there.
So clearly there's some big goals on the agenda, hopefully some of which will be achieved at COP27 this year and of course COP28 in the UAE next year. Again, I know you worked on bringing COP28 here. What do you hope that the UAE will achieve at that major meeting here in November next year? And given that the Paris Agreement 2015 that you mentioned there, given that central goal of reducing global temperatures still hasn't been achieved, can we expect to see any real progress at COP28? Do you have an idea of what the agenda will look like yet?
Well, right now is a very difficult time for the climate discussions. We've talked about the situation with the global energy crisis. We've talked about the constraints for many countries. We've talked about the fact that financing is not being made available. We have the next COP in Egypt. It's going to be a very important COP. It's the first COP since Glasgow that is the implementation COP. This is how the Egyptian government and the rest of the world wants to see it, that we're moving to implementation and away from negotiations. But it's going to be increasingly difficult, especially after the Bonn meeting, in my view. The issues around whether we get to an agreement around adaptation and financing for adaptation, whether we get to an agreement around what the meaning of loss and damage is. This is something that vulnerable countries are insisting on, that there is a responsibility for developed countries that have caused this problem to provide the financing, but for vulnerable countries to be able to deal with the impacts. But there is a huge resistance from developed countries to doing that. So that's going to be a very tough discussion in Egypt. Hopefully there will be some momentum coming out of Egypt. But I think the key thing that will happen at COP28 in the UAE is that this will be the first global stocktake that will happen since the Paris Agreement, where we will actually take stock of who did what and where we are in terms of climate action. And out of that will come a program for what the next 5 years should look like.
And certainly we've heard these calls continue for several years now. Let's hope that COP28 is the one that's really able to implement those changes. Final question today. What do you see as the most significant danger that we're currently facing when it comes to climate change if we don't adopt some of these urgent goals that you've talked about today? Frankly speaking, what will our world look like in a decade?
Actually, it's quite frightening if you look at the science, and I think that 98% of climate scientists agree with the IPCC in terms of projections of climate impacts. And I think the most scary thing is how many of these impacts are interrelated, how they're unpredictable, because we are still not in a position to understand fully the severity of these, and how they're escalating year on year as we are unable to stop carbon emissions. My fear is that we will have multiple crises happening periodically in different parts of the world, which will begin to impact global food chains. We already have vulnerability on food security. We're seeing climate vulnerable agriculture in many poor countries where, frankly, you could face very serious food deficit situations in the future. We're facing a situation where we're seeing, an urgent need for water management as freshwater resources are declining, and that there is potential of conflict over resources like food and water. And we're seeing processes of degradation that will lead to migration push of people moving to regions just to survive. So if we think that the migration crisis today is a big thing, if we allow climate impacts to continue unchecked, all of these multiple crises coming together will create a level of instability in this world that will be almost impossible to manage.
Certainly devastating outcome unless real action is taken now. Dr. Adnan Amin, Senior Advisor to the UAE Climate Envoy, thank you very much for your insights today. Really interesting discussion, and let's hope we see that proper change soon.
Thank you. Great pleasure.